Thanks as always for listening to Fluff and Crunch. Today's episode is about Castles and Crusades, a little bit about the system, a little bit about some of the books, and some commentary on how I've been using it to run a Pathfinder Adventure path. Well, hello. If you're watching this or listening to it, you're only going to hear my voice or only see me today. And that's because Chris and I have had some scheduling challenges lately because he is on the other side of the planet. Or rather, we're on opposite sides of the planet, different hemispheres, however you want to say it. And it's been tough to schedule. We usually have a bit of a surplus, a backlog of episodes. We're a few weeks ahead. But just things, life, have gotten in the way. And we have not been able to record as many episodes as we'd like. So I have recorded this one just in case our next recording session falls through so that you, dear listeners, have something to listen to. I want to talk today a little bit about Castles and Crusades. Castles and Crusades is a fantasy role-playing game put out by Troll Games, and I think it's a pretty popular game in a subset of the fantasy gaming population. Obviously, the fantasy gaming population, tabletop-wise, is overwhelmingly D&D 5e. So every other subgroup is quite small. But Castles Crusades has some very vocal proponents, and I've also seen a lot of misconceptions about it. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about what brought me to the game, what I'm doing with it right now, some of the things about the game that I think are worth mentioning system-wise and setting as well, and try to clear up some misconceptions. So this is not meant to be a deep history of the game itself. It's more of a practical, what's it about now and what can I do with it now kind of episode. So if you're a regular listener, you know that I have many bones to pick with 5th edition D&D, that I'm not a fan of it. I'm not going to grind on and on about that. There's no reason. However, the D20 based more of a stripped down, simple fantasy system is of interest to a lot of people. A lot of people enjoy that kind of D&D feel. And 2D20, my favorite system, does not provide that. It provides a very different feel at the table. Mechanically, I think Chris puts it well. He says that 2D20 can be kind of gamey in that there are some significant meta layers with the meta currencies and things like that that make it for a very different feel. So my group had been interested in playing a fantasy game, and I was interested in getting back behind the screen, figuratively, because I actually don't use a screen at the table. And I really didn't want to run 5e. I really didn't want to run Pathfinder. And I didn't actually want to run Aris to power a fantasy game for us because I didn't want to feel like I was forcing my game on my players, even though they were interested in it. And also, frankly, I've played a lot of 2D20 over the last few years. And so I wanted something a little bit different. You know, hey, I love pizza, but that doesn't mean I want to have pizza for every single meal. So I started fishing around and looking, and I had heard of C&C. And the folks at Troll Lord are nice enough and confident enough in their game that they actually provide their 8th printing of the Players Handbook for free as a PDF download. So I downloaded the thing and I read through it. And by the way, you notice I said printing, not edition. Troll Lord, since the beginning of this game, the creation of it, they've made tweaks, from what I understand, to the system, but they really haven't changed very much. So they don't have new editions, at least they have not thus far. They have new printings. And so the art's different. They add some things to it. Like, for example, the 9th printing of the Player's Handbook, which I have with me here in physical copy, the 9th printing takes classes all the way up to like 24th level, whereas the 8th printing stops at 12th level. So you could say, well, you know, it's different. There's more to it, but it's not like the difference in edition changes like 3rd edition D&D to 4th edition D&D to 5th edition D&D, where there are significant compatibility issues between the editions. Castles of Crusades doesn't do that. So anyway, I downloaded it, I read it, I was interested in it. As I do, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and read a bunch of reviews about it, and I thought, this is worth looking into. So I picked up the PHB, and I'll circle back to my purchase experience with these things here in a moment as well. Picked it up, read it, decided this is what I want to run. And this is why I decided this is what I want to run. And this is really the meat of this episode. What's this game, Castles and Crusades, all about? Castles Crusades is a D20 based roll high system that is in a lot of ways in the most simple like perspective on the mechanics is very similar to third edition or even fifth edition D&D. There is a unified mechanic. You have the same six stats. You have hit points. You have saving throws, although those are handled a little differently than fifth edition. And you roll a d20 plus a modifier or two, depending on the situation, and you try to meet or beat, roll equal to or greater than a number, and then you're successful, and then you do damage. And a lot of the classes, it's a class-based system. A lot of this is going to be very familiar. Anyone who has played fifth edition, fourth edition, anyone who's played any edition of D&D is going to look at Castles Crusades and say, wow, so much of this looks very, very familiar to me. Where the game differs is in the core system, some of the things that the core system does, and my perspective at least, all the things that the writers deliberately left out. And then there's also a bit of Castles and Crusades. There's a feel and a vibe and an experience, I think, that the authors want to try to enable, facilitate at the table that the rules do. So, like I said, core mechanic is essentially the same as third edition or fifth edition. We bring back for various classes, instead of a base attack bonus, there is a bonus to hit, which varies by class. A fighter starts out at first level with +1. Okay, great. Well, a rogue has a +0 at first level. And so those grow at different rates depending on the class. If you played third edition, you're going, oh, yeah, that totally makes sense. If you played Pathfinder, okay, that totally makes sense. I'm not going to go into great gory detail about the combat mechanics because, again, you can download that Player's Handbook for free and you can read them. Initiative is really simple. You use your bonus to hit and either your strength or your dex modifier, depending on whether it's melee or ranged. You roll versus armor class. There are situational modifiers. As you would expect, there's a table of those. It's not too long, but they're things that make sense. And thus, I mean, if you're a Pathfinder or a Pathfinder First Edition or D&D Third Edition player, or if you like the idea of, I'd like to have a bunch of different kinds of combat modifiers, like are you on the higher ground or hiding behind something, things like that. I think you would find interest and value in this because it looks like that. Just the lists are shorter. It's not as detailed. Damage it's damage, and it's a stat modifier plus a die roll based on the weapon. Hit point totals tend to be on par with, fifth edition, third edition on from there. Healing is a lot slower. And this is the first moment where I can say there's a vibe thing going on here. The designers put their thumb on the scale of the system to say, you know what, we want kind of a first or second edition feel a little bit, but without the convoluted mechanics. And so healing is harder. Healing takes longer, and it definitely does. And when your character is not as super heroic and can't just heal like that, now, if you have a cleric around, that's going to help. However, you still take a while to heal, and those spells run out quickly. That changes your behavior as a player, and I like that. I like players to have to think instead of just kicking the door because they know that they're basically invincible. So there's a moment where I'll depart from talking about some of the particulars of the system and say that what I've seen a lot of conversation about C&C Online is based off of this misconception that it's an OSR game or it's an Osric game. It's one of these old school Renaissance or those types of things, like it's a throwback. In terms of general vibe, I agree. Mechanically, I totally disagree. This is not like sitting down with basic or expert or old school essentials. One of them, I mean, that's a name of a retro clone. Or even turning back to, like I said, the basic or expert rules. This is not that. There is a unified core mechanic. The system is streamlined around that core mechanic. Non-combat task resolution is very simple, and I'll get to that in a moment. And so in that respect, it is very much unlike mechanically the earliest versions of the game, but the vibe of it actually, it's an interesting thing. It feels like an older version of D&D, but it does not mechanically function like one, which I actually think is a good thing. Now, how about non-combat resolution? There are no skills. I almost slipped and said skills. There are no skills. You go, wait a minute, how do you do things? There are no skills. Everything that's non-combat and saves is based around attribute checks. So, whereas in modern versions of D20 games, and 5e being one of them, Pathfinder another one, you have a stat skill combination and some kind of proficiency or other bonuses, sources of bonuses, and you roll, and you have a skill or you don't have a skill. And I know 5th edition says you can do this, but I have never met anyone who has played 5th edition with no skills and just run everything as an attribute check. Well, that's what Castles and Crusades does. So if you want to push something out of the way, that's a strength check. If you want to climb up a wall, that's a dexterity check. If you need to resist a poison, depending on the nature of it, that might be a constitution check. Okay. And here's where I think this is a really clever innovation that Troll Lord came up with for CNC. They have what they call the siege engine. That is their, the WotC had the D20 mechanic, or the D20 game. They have that. That is the title for their system. Now we call it the 5th edition of, whatever. They call theirs the siege engine. Okay. All capital, the word siege, all the letters. And what this very simply is, it's kind of funny because when I first started reading, I was like, oh, it's going to be this really involved mechanic. It's really not. It's actually quite simple. When you roll an attribute check to do something, to convince someone using a charisma check, to intuit something using wisdom, to figure out some naughty intellectual puzzle or something like that, that would be intelligence. You roll a D20, obviously. You add your stat bonus if you have a stat bonus. And then if it sits within what would generally be considered to be the purview of your class, and the suggestions from in their book are that the GM should be, or rather the castle keeper, that's what the GM is called in Castles and Crusades, it's castle keeper. So the castle keeper believes that this sits within the purview of your class, and they should be, the benefit of the doubt should be on the player. Then you add your level. Now think about this for a second. If you're a rogue and you're used to doing sneaky thievy kinds of things, climbing up a wall, or let's say stealthing, moving stealthily, that's going to be a dex check. It makes sense that as you get better as a rogue and you do those kinds of things and you practice in that way, that your rogueliness is going to be applicable to that general sense of who you are as a class, is going to be applicable to tasks that fall under that broad heading. So if you're a 3rd level rogue and you have a dex bonus of 2, you're going to add 5 to your siege check, that is the D20 roll, and you're going to try to meter beat a number. But there's more. Castles and Crusades has this really nifty idea of primary and secondary attributes. And at character creation, whether you are a human or demi-human, they use that term, so elves, dwarves, those kinds of things are demi-humans. In D&D, when you play a human, you get some mechanical bonuses to make up for the fact that you don't have all these racial abilities dark vision or whatever. What CNC does is they account for that by if you play a human, you choose 3 of your attributes to be primary and 3 to be then therefore secondary. If you're a demi-human, you only get 2 primary attributes and you get 4 secondary attributes. What does that mean? Okay. When you roll siege checks, that is when you roll non-combat attribute rolls, this has nothing to do with combat. Okay. Put aside combat. When you roll a siege check, what's going to happen is the base difficulty, and this might sound a little confusing, but I'll make sense of it. The base difficulty for a check that's related to a primary attribute is 12. The base difficulty for a secondary attribute is 18. Okay, so let's go back to that rogue, that thief. Yeah, rogue. Sorry, the rogue is trying to be stealthy. The rogue is third level, has a +2 dexterity bonus. That character has +5. So you roll the d20, and if and dex in that case, dex is going to be that character's primary, one of the primary attributes, because each class has a single primary attribute that's required. So a fighter, it's strength. Okay. Um, a cleric, it's wisdom. Each class has one primary attribute you must choose. The other primary attributes you have, you can choose as you wish. And I'll come back to that in a second because I think that's really neat. Our rogue example, third level, +2. So you have a total of a base bonus of 5. You're going to roll the die 20 and you're going to try to meet or beat 12. That's your absolute base. Now, the GM can adjust that based on the situation. It's broad daylight. It's going to be a little harder, so I'm going to add 3. And there's guidance in the book for how to adjudicate this. So if your base for that difficulty was 12, because it's based on a primary attribute, the GM says, you know what, I'm going to add 3 to it. Now it's 15. So you still have your +5. You're trying to meet or beat 15. Okay. Now, if you are a cleric and and dex is not one of your primary attributes, you're trying to creep around, your GM might say, listen, creeping around quietly is not like so far out clericness that I'm not going to hold that against you. So I will let you, I will let you add your level to it. But let's say that cleric also has a dex bonus of 2, but dexterity is not one of that character's chosen primary attributes. So their base difficulty is now 18. So and they're also third level. So 3 plus the 2, they still have that base of +5. And the GM says, it's broad daylight, so actually it's not going to be 18, it's going to be 21. You can see here, you're like, wow, that's really high. Remember, because you're adding the level in there, as your character levels, your character's going to get better at everything that broadly fits under their class. And really the only time that a GM Castle Keeper, is recommended to not include the class level in a siege roll is if a character is trying to do something that would muscle into the class of another. So if the cleric goes up and tries to pick a lock, the cleric's not going to have, native ability in that's related to their class. So that's when the GM would say, and I'll just say GM, that's when the GM would say, you know what, we're not going to include your level here because it's really not related to your broad career field. By default, you do, but when it involves some degree of niche protection for classes to keep each class special within each area, then you would exclude the level. And you might think to yourself, well, that might sound a little fiddly. One of them has a base of 12 and one of them has a base of 18. There's another way to look at it. And this is actually the way that I run it at my table. Primary attributes get a base of +6. A base of +6 plus their level, plus whatever stat modifier, attribute modifier they have. Now think about it. The math comes out the same. Because if you tell the player, if the fighter who has whose strength is one of their primary attributes, that is class required, so every single fighter has at least one of their primary attributes is strength. The fighter is trying to push over, this is actually an example from the book. Fighter's trying to push a statue over on a goblin, going to squish the goblin. Terrific. So the fighter already has, you could either say your base is 12, or you could just say everyone's base difficulty is 18, but if you're using a primary attribute, you also have +6. So your third level fighter with let's just go with +2 strength to make life easy. Your third level fighter, that's 3, with a +2 strength bonus, plus another 6, because strength is a primary, already has +11. They got to beat an 18. And if there aren't any other situational modifiers that the GM uses to increase that difficulty, or actually in some situations they could decrease it, okay, for whatever reason, then they're rolling against an 18. That's how I run it at my table. Everybody rolls the base difficulty, which I then can modify depending on the situation. The base difficulty for non-combat checks is 18. But if you're using a primary attribute, you automatically get an additional +6, plus your stat modifier, plus your level, plus any situational modifiers. So that works out. That's really easy. Now, last piece on this whole primary secondary attribute thing. If you're a human, 3 of your attributes are primary, 3 are secondary. Aside from the one that is required by class, you can allocate the other 2 to whatever you want. And I think this is actually a simple, elegant, and really neat way to enable differentiation between characters of the same class. So for example, let's say you're playing a human fighter. Strength is going to be one of your primaries. You have 2 others to choose. You can be like, well, do I want to be a tough, strong, smart fighter? How about a tough, fast, witty, charismatic fighter? Okay. So by allocating, by choosing your other primary attributes, or if you're a demi-human, you just get 1 because you get racial abilities that balances it out. You can differentiate one class from another forevermore, because again, as you level, you're always going to use your level bonus, whatever your current level is, as a bonus, but you'll get that flat +6, the way I look at it, on any primary attribute-based siege roll. And again, this applies to all the non-combat stuff as well as saving throws. And much like in older versions of D&D, you have, depending on the nature of the threat, there are different types of threats that are assigned under each of the attributes for a saving throw. So you know that if you're faced with a certain kind of spell or poison or whatever, you know, okay, based on that attack, I'm saving versus this attribute, and that's just a siege roll. Initially, it was a little wonky, and until I read in the Castle Keeper's Guide, which I'll come to in a second, the suggestion that, hey, you don't need to look at this as 12 and 18. You can just say it's 18 with +6 for the primaries. So once we did that, then it became very simple. I just had everyone write +6 next to each of their primary attributes on their character sheet, and from that point forward, it was very simple. So, like, that's the core system. It's D20 roll high. There are no skills. And it's interesting, actually, in the book, the authors assert, they're very explicit about why they excluded skills. And I think it's an interesting argument. I think it's valid. I don't know if I fully agree with it, but I totally get where they're coming from. They say they leave out skills because skills actually limit people. The skills, they believe, limit player creativity, because they say this is athletics, or this is carousing, or this is however granular the skill system is. And what that does then is it drives players to behave in a certain way to follow their stats. Whereas if it's more abstract, like climbing up a wall, is that dex or is it strength? Well, depending on the nature of it, maybe one or the other. Holding your breath for a long time, that's probably constitution. Running a long distance, is that dexterity? Oh, well, that's maybe constitution. Like, where's the break-even point? What this does is it creates at the table thought by players and GM, and some conversation about, well, like, how do you go about solving the problem? Instead of like, well, I have carousing of plus whatever, and so I carouse. And I think that the creativity that this enables, and also this variable of primary versus secondary, creating more ripples and differentiation between the characters at the table, it can encourage people. Sure, a lot of players are going to chase their highest stats. I mean, who wouldn't do that in real life? But it just provides a broader category of work rather than a bunch of individual skills, and then you dump experience into a single skill and you become a boring one-trick pony where, the hammer and everything's a nail. In play, this is working. It took some initial adjustment over this idea of like, well, where are my skills? What am I going to do? But I think we've gotten used to it. So I like that. I like it. I like how it works out. And this also points to one of the things I mentioned a bit ago, the many things the authors left out deliberately. They leave out skills. They've left out feats, although there are things that they have that are like feats that are optional in the Castle Keeper's Guide. You have a lot of different class abilities, and the class abilities are all pretty different. And there are easier classes, like the fighter, as is, the norm in most games like this. The fighter is typically one of the easiest classes to play, whereas spellcasting classes offer more and different options, and therefore a little more complicated. But instead of having feats, and I'll just use that word broadly in place of talents or whatever else we want to call them, what other games call them, by leaving that out and relying on your class abilities to be the special things, the things that further differentiate you in terms of what you're able to do. Um, I think that provides niche control, but it also simplifies things. When you add a level, you're just looking at a class level table and saying, all right, I added these extra abilities. Something that I do like is that instead of, and this is just personal preference over recent versions of 5e, where you'll have lots of different class abilities. And sure, some of them like sneak attack grow over time, but you tend to have, as you level, many more and different class abilities. CNC, I think, pushes a little more toward having a, a lesser diversity of class abilities. There's still a lot, but that the class abilities grow significantly over time. I think that's interesting. Another thing too about classes that I found very interesting, especially with your more like what you would think of traditionally as more skill-based characters, like rogues, rangers as well. They get the class abilities are front end loaded. So within your first couple of levels, you've got virtually all of your class abilities. And then they just grow in power. And sometimes there's some nuanced changes to them over time in the levels. But instead of like, the ranger and the rogue, I believe they start with like 8 or 9 or like 10 powers, the class abilities at first level. It's pretty amazing, actually. You can do a lot, but you won't do it as well as you will later on as you're leveling, because remember, every single time you level, your level is being added into those non-combat roles. And like I said, it's working at the table. One last thing about classes. Like I said, I'm not going to get into great gory detail about what each of the classes are and how they function and all that stuff. You can download the Players Handbook for free, and there's a link in the notes, and you can do that. But one of the conceits, one of the stated rules as written things about CNC that really threw my players for a loop initially is they have dispensed with common experience thresholds for leveling. So this is something that has started with third edition and is pretty normal now in like level-based games, no matter what company puts them out. Castles and Crusades classes level at different rates. So a rogue will level way sooner than a fighter, who will level sooner than an illusionist or a wizard. And so what you end up having over time is you have a party with characters of different levels, but the same number of experience points. Now, if you are a newer gamer, this might sound like some kind of heresy or something freakish and weird. They have an explanation for why they do this. And it actually, I think it makes sense. Aside from the fact that, think about this for a minute, a wizard, like high knowledge requirement for learning spells. It's going to take longer for someone to learn and grow in something that's inherently more complex and challenging than sneaking around and climbing up walls. So your rogue levels pretty darn quickly, your wizard far more slowly. However, as they pick up abilities, each of the classes grows in power. The authors are not trying to create this like the lie of this perfect mechanical parity at level between the classes. But what I've seen in practice is that the party that I'm running right now has a cleric, has a rogue, and then there are, I modified the illusionist class a little bit, like redubbed it the sorcerer, and I changed some things about it, but there's that. And then we have an optional class that's out of one of the other books from the series that's called a magic user, which I love. That is so first edition, the magic user. And the magic user is this really weird, very different magic using class that doesn't have spells, but it works. What has happened in my game, when we've been playing it for several months, is that now that they've accumulated experience, they're leveling, and they're all different levels, and it works. So once you get away from the idea that unless the characters are the same level, there's some kind of disparity between them, When you instead look at it and say the characters are going to grow over time and they're going to grow differently, but they're all going to be able to be functional alongside one another. Once you get rid of that initial thought and accept the possibility of that second one, you'll recognize that it works. A couple other things that I want to talk about the system. Magic rules as written is like I'd say very Vankian, in that there are all kinds of time requirements for how long does it take to pray for or concentrate or memorize a spell, and how do you like the spell slots of 5e. That's not how it works. And so I think some people might chafe against that. There's that. You read that in a player's handbook, you might see that and say, "Whoa, that seems a little harsh." It is it the pew 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 fire and forget, almost endless spells, cantrips and stuff like that doesn't exist. It's far more like second or first edition in terms of how much magic can a spellcaster get, use, and prepare and have. So there's that. I do want to address one thing about the GMing side of things. The monster book, Monsters and Treasures, presents monsters, a lot of them, that offer a very different stat block than what you see for player characters. And the term hit dice has meant something different in like every version of D&D where it's been present. But hit dice are front and center for handling monsters in Castles and Crusades. And without getting into all the details, which I said I wasn't going to, a monster's hit dice number is going to be one of, if not its most important number. And it's a wonderful thing actually for running monsters, because when you're rolling, hit dice is the modifier for basic, not everything, but most things that a monster is going to do. Attack, for example, or try to outsmart or out stealth or whatever. You're just using hit dice. And so I'm able to run monsters directly out of the book without having to like write down all these stat blocks and because the stat blocks are so streamlined. I've found that that has helped tremendously. So so hit dice are a big deal. And the monsters book has, like I said, a whole bunch of different monsters in it and a bunch of treasure tables. I have not used treasure tables in decades, and I have embraced them full on. It's a lot of fun, actually, just to sit down and like roll treasure types and how many coins and how many gems and how many that kind of stuff. That warms my my ye olde player heart. Like I said, I don't think it's worth digging into all of the details of how, like I said before, combat works. Um, but but the monster stat system is streamlined and presented in a way that actually makes it really easy to GM, and I appreciate that. Now, talking about the books, and I'll mention a little bit about their default worlds. A little bit about the books. There's Players Handbook, there is a Castle Keeper's Guide, and there's Monsters and Treasures. You only need two of them. Castle Keeper's Guide, which is it's a brick, it's a big book, is explicitly listed as optional. You're like, whoa, wait a minute, how weird. All the core rules are in the Player's Handbook. And all of the monsters and magic items and treasures and all that kind of stuff, that's all, and the experience system and how you gain experience from defeating threats and monsters and stuff, all that's in Monsters and Treasures. So it's kind of a cool thing. You only need those two books. If you want to play the game, you only need the PHB. If you want to run the game, you just need those two books. Now, the Castle Keeper's Guide is, like I said, it's all optional rules, and it is organized by chapter of like all the different angles on the game: character creation, magic, encounters, all kinds of things. And I mean, I get excited about new shiny things. Who doesn't? But honestly, the Castle Keeper's Guide is gold. It is totally optional. It's not necessary. If you want to run the game rules as written or play with house rules and stuff, you don't need it. I recommend getting it. It has some outstanding advice and ideas and a heap of optional rules or alternate rules, both actually. Things you can add to and things you can sub out. Like, for example, it has several different kinds of approaches to the magic system. It has spell points. It has spell slots. It has, you cast and you have to roll to see if you cast. It has all kinds of different things. And see, and actually what I've done is we have the magic user, we have a cleric, and then we have the sorcerer, which is like a recast illusionist. I think I mentioned that. Magic user, we're running rules as written because it functions the way we all like. We are using one of the alternate magic systems to power the sorcerer. And we are using spell slots for the cleric. And I'm really happy with this, one, because I like those two alternate systems actually better than the rules as written in the Player's Handbook. But I also like the fact that two different spellcasting classes function differently at the table. I find no reason for, like I said, in 5e, or this is the same thing in 3rd edition, all the spellcasting classes really beneath the hood are almost the same. They all use spell slots. They all have cantrips. They're all kind of the same. No, our gnome, who is a cleric, is going to use her magic because she gets her magic differently than the guy who's there, like figuratively with his hair on fire because for some reason he can like make magic stuff happen, the sorcerer. So using those alternate rules, we've been able to provide some variety and a different texture. Like when the sorcerer casts spells and does things versus the cleric, it feels different because it functions differently at the table, although it all sits well within the core rules, the unified mechanic. So Castle Keeper's Guide, honestly, is golden. Great GMing advice and great explanations of these alternate mechanics to give you a sense of why does this maybe function differently. And for me, I enjoy that because it then gets me thinking about how can I use the system to facilitate the story. And I just did. I just mentioned that because I want magic casting classes that are different to function differently. I want that to feel different at the table. So these alternate systems have enabled it. So again, you only need 2 of those core books, but all 3 of them is nice. Now I've picked up some other books because I've become a little bit of a slobbering fanboy of the game. I've picked up several other books from them, and I've also picked them up because Troll Lord Games, the folks who are behind it, at least one of them is a veteran, and so they are very kind to veterans, and so they give 50% off. Zoinks. If you order directly from them, they give you half off the sticker price of their books if you can prove that you're a veteran. And they have I think, a simple, respectful, and reasonable, non-intrusive way to determine if you're a vet. And so I've ordered a bunch of books from them because they're half off and I want to support them and so on and so forth. So I have picked up some other books and I don't know very much. Is it Erda? I don't know how to pronounce their default setting world. Through some of the books that I have picked up some ideas, especially like deities and things like that, some ideas of what this world is like. But I really can't say anything about the world because I know nothing about it because I'm not using it. Because I am using Castles and Crusades, as you listeners might recognize or remember, I'm using it to run the Pathfinder Kingmaker adventure path. And I'll wrap up with this commentary. How's that going? As a GM, and story-wise and mechanically, how is that going? And the answer is well. Initially, I overthought it. I looked at all the Pathfinder stats and I looked at the experience threshold, all that kind of stuff, and I overthought the heck out of it, which anyone who knows me personally is not at all surprised that I would do that. I overthought it and I overcomplicated it. And then when I stepped back and breathed a little bit, I looked at leveling in Castles and Crusades, if you do rules as written, is very slow. It's going to take a long time for you to climb those levels. It's not this like, this D&D thing now where they're like, oh, hit 2nd level by the 2nd adventure and 3rd level by the 3rd adventure. And then like a new level every other, everything is like, it burns hot and it burns up quickly in terms of your pushing your character up through advancement. CNC deliberately slows that process down. However, there's commentary and suggestions if you want to speed it up. So what I did is I looked at how quickly do my players expect to grow their characters, and how quickly do I want to do that as they move through this adventure path. And so I came to a decision in myself as to how I want to handle that. I'm happy with how it's going so far. And what I then did is I set experience rewards. I looked through the Pathfinder book and I have adjusted the experience rewards there, which obviously are Pathfinder First Edition based. I've adjusted those so that as they defeat, overcome, whatever, different challenges and things that are presented in the adventure, they're getting an adjusted amount of experience that has thus far enabled them to level, albeit at different rates because they're different character classes, at an overall pace that the players seem satisfied with and I'm happy with. It will enable them to meet the challenges that are to come, keep things challenging, but not let things stagnate. And that's hard, you know. So that's what I'm doing with it. And otherwise, converting monsters, like the few that I've had to convert, honestly, once I remind myself to not overthink it, I just turn to the Monsters and Treasures book. I find something that's like it, if it's not already in the book, and I just reskin. And that has worked fine. I have 2 books of NPCs that are, from Troll Lord that I've been using to stand it. I will grab at level or at the appropriate level different major NPCs, not just your throwaways like Bandit 1, Bandit 2, but like named NPCs, that especially in this adventure path that, you're in one place for a long time. And so there are plenty of named NPCs that are going to be recurring. And so I'm just using characters from these NPC books and, giving them the name out of the Pathfinder book and choosing a class that, in my opinion, best approximates what the story purpose of that NPC is in the book. So in summation, Castles of Crusades is a simple, stripped down, D20 based fantasy game that in a lot of ways mechanically is very similar to the core of every edition of D&D from 3rd onward. Like that's the absolute most elemental dimension of the mechanics. But it's also built to feel and run more like earlier versions of D&D that are less superpowered, less super heroic, and accept, in fact, embrace a slower pace of advancement. And in so doing, also challenge players, because they're not super heroic, to think more and think differently as they move through the world. Content support for the game, I think, is excellent. There's a lot of different content, a lot of different books out there. And the physical quality of the books, in my opinion, is outstanding. I haven't had any problems with these books falling apart or anything like that. I'm using them a lot now. They look nice. They read well. And if you're a veteran, that 50% off is absolutely killer. I'm a huge supporter of the friendly local game store. Absolutely, but 50% off is that's a deal I can't turn down. So that's a good one. So anyway, I'll put links and let me know what you think about the system if you've played it. If you have any questions about it, there are plenty of groups and forums and YouTubes and garbage like that, people talking about it. But if you want to talk about the game, leave a comment. Like and subscribe. I'm supposed to tell you that repeatedly. Leave a comment, join our Discord, get in the conversation about the game. And again, you can download the PHB for free and read through it. My one last piece on this is a bit of advice. If you download the PHB, try to take the game objectively. Read it for what it is. Look at it for what it seeks to do, not what it does differently than 5e. That was a hurdle that some of my players had initially, like, yeah, but it's not 5e. I recognize its strength and its fighting, and there's so many similarities, but they each function a little differently. You have to treat it for what it is and not what it isn't. But in some ways, when you look at the outside of it, you don't dig down into the depths of how it functions and why it functions that way. You keep asking yourself, yeah, but sneak attack, and that is an ability in this, sneak attack is X. Well, sneak attack is X in 5e. It's not the same in Castles and Crusades. So if you read the thing, try to take it objectively. Take it for what it is, what it seeks to do, what it seeks to accomplish, and how it tries to do that. So anyway, yeah, again, like and subscribe, get involved in the conversation, so on and so forth. Thank you for listening, and have a great day. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.